In the quiet spaces between what was and what would become, there lived a dream that had no name. It stirred in the salt-laden winds that swept across an endless ocean, carrying whispers of liberty on currents older than memory. Across the vast Atlantic, beyond the familiar boundaries of kings and crowns, lay a wilderness that waited with infinite patience. This was a land where ancient forests held their breath, where rivers ran wild and free, where the very soil seemed to pulse with possibility. Here, in this place untouched by the weight of centuries, ordinary souls would dare to imagine something extraordinary, a nation born not from conquest, but from conviction. The story begins not with trumpets or fanfare, but with the gentle lapping of waves against wooden hulls, with the creak of rope and canvas, with hearts that beat faster as they glimpsed a distant shore where tomorrow might be different from yesterday. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts just like yours. The year was 1607, and the Virginia sun cast long shadows across a landscape that knew no European footsteps. The air hung thick with humidity and possibility as three small ships, Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, anchored in the waters of what would become Jamestown. 104 English settlers stepped onto shores that whispered with the voices of the Powhatan people, who had called this land home for generations beyond counting. Captain John Smith, a man whose very presence seemed to command attention, surveyed the marshy ground with eyes that had seen the courts of kings and the fury of Ottoman battles. Yet here, in this untamed wilderness, he found himself humbled by challenges no courtly training had prepared him for. The settlers, many of them gentlemen who had never worked with their hands, faced a reality that cared nothing for titles or bloodlines. Hunger was democracy's cruelest teacher, and the Virginia wilderness its most unforgiving classroom. As the months passed, the settlement teetered on the edge of failure. Disease stalked the wooden palisades like a patient predator. The brackish water of the James River offered little relief, and the stores of grain dwindled with each passing day. Yet something profound was happening in this struggle for survival that would echo through the centuries. In the face of absolute necessity, the rigid hierarchies of the old world began to crack and shift. Smith's famous declaration that he who does not work, does not eat, became more than policy. It became a founding principle of American character. Here, in the mud and toil of early Jamestown, the notion that worth came from labor rather than birth began to take root. The soil itself seemed to demand this transformation, as if the land would only yield its gifts to those willing to shed. The pretenses of European society. Meanwhile, 13 years later and hundreds of miles to the north, another drama was unfolding on the windswept shores of Massachusetts. The Mayflower, heavy with the dreams and fears of 102 souls, creaked against its anchor in Provincetown Harbor. These were not gold seekers or adventurers, but families fleeing religious persecution, carrying their faith like a lamp in the darkness of an uncertain world. William Bradford, his face weathered by salt spray and hardship, gazed upon a landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly into winter's embrace. The Pilgrims had arrived at the edge of November, when the New England coast revealed its most austere face. Pine and oak stood sentinel over beaches strewn with granite boulders, while the wind carried promises of snow and survival's stern test. But it was here, in the cramped cabin of their ship, that something unprecedented occurred. 41 men, gathered around a simple document that would become known as the Mayflower Compact. In words both humble and revolutionary, They pledged to covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. This was not a declaration of independence from England, but something perhaps more radical, an assertion that governance required the consent of the governed. Elder William Brewster, his voice steady despite the uncertainty that surrounded them, spoke the words that would bind them together, a promise to create just and equal laws for the general good of the colony. In that moment, as quills scratched against parchment and names were signed by candlelight, the seeds of democratic governance were planted in American soil. The winter that followed tested every word of their compact. Half of the Mayflower's passengers would not see spring's return, yet those who survived carried forward something more valuable than gold: the lived experience that free people could govern themselves through mutual agreement and shared sacrifice. As these early settlements struggled to establish themselves, a third current was flowing through the colonial waters, one that would leave an indelible stain on the American story. In 1619, just 12 years after Jamestown's founding, a Dutch ship arrived carrying human cargo that had been stolen from African shores. 20 souls, their names lost to history but their presence marking a tragic beginning, were sold into bondage on Virginia's soil. This terrible contradiction, the simultaneous birth of freedom and slavery, would haunt the American experiment from its earliest moments. Even as colonists spoke of liberty and self-governance, they built their prosperity on the backs of those who had been denied the most fundamental freedom of all. The wealth that flowed from tobacco fields tended by enslaved hands would fuel colonial growth and create fortunes that shaped the emerging American economy. Yet even within this darkness, seeds of resistance were being planted. African Americans, whether enslaved or free, began to create communities, preserve traditions, and find ways to assert their humanity despite the legal and social structures designed to deny it. Their music, their faith, their quiet acts of defiance and preservation would become integral threads in the American tapestry. As the 17th century deepened, the American colonies began to develop distinct personalities, each shaped by the particular dreams and circumstances of their founders. In Massachusetts Bay, John Winthrop's vision of a city upon a hill took root among communities where the church bell and the town meeting were equally sacred institutions. These Puritan settlements operated on the radical notion that educated citizens could read scripture for themselves and participate in their own governance. The Massachusetts colonists established schools with an urgency that revealed their deepest values. Satan seeks to keep men from the knowledge of the scriptures, declared their school laws. But beneath this religious motivation lay something revolutionary, the belief that ordinary people deserved education. Harvard College, founded in 1636, stood as testimony to their conviction that learning and liberty walked hand in hand. Yet even within this community of the devout dissent found its voice. Roger Williams, a minister whose conscience would not bend to conformity, challenged the very foundations of Puritan authority. His insistence that civil government had no authority over matters of faith led to his banishment from Massachusetts. But his exile became the founding of Rhode Island, a colony where religious liberty would flourish. As nowhere else in the colonial world, Williams's Providence plantation became a sanctuary for those whose beliefs placed them at odds with prevailing orthodoxies. Baptists, Quakers, Jews, and others found refuge in a place where, as Williams declared, forced worship was soul rape. This radical experiment in religious tolerance would prove to be among the most prescient of colonial innovations, anticipating by more than a century the First Amendment's protection of religious freedom. To the south, William Penn's Quaker colony of Pennsylvania embodied another form of idealistic experiment. Penn, himself a convert to the Society of Friends, envisioned a holy experiment where peace and prosperity would flow from just treatment of all inhabitants. His frame of government granted unprecedented civil liberties, and his fair dealing with Native American tribes created an era of relative harmony unknown in other colonies. Philadelphia, Penn's city of brotherly love, grew rapidly into a cosmopolitan center where German craftsmen, Welsh farmers, and English merchants mingled with Quaker families whose simple dress and plain speech marked their commitment to spiritual equality. The Pennsylvania colony's religious tolerance attracted immigrants from across Europe, creating a diversity that would become characteristically American. In the Chesapeake, a different society was emerging around the golden leaf of tobacco. Virginia's plantation culture created enormous wealth for a small elite, while depending entirely on the labor of enslaved Africans. The great houses that rose along the James River Shirley, Westover, Carter's Grove stood as monuments to this prosperity, their elegant Georgian facades hiding the brutal realities of slave quarters and tobacco fields. Yet even in Virginia, ideas of liberty and self-governance took root. The House of Burgesses, established in 1619, became the first representative assembly in the New World. Planters, who ruled their estates with absolute authority, paradoxically insisted on their rights as Englishmen to participate in their own governance. This contradiction between the practice of slavery and the ideology of freedom would ultimately prove impossible to sustain. The Carolina colonies, founded later in the century, embodied these contradictions even more starkly. The fundamental constitutions of Carolina, drafted with input from the philosopher John Locke, promised religious tolerance and representative government while simultaneously establishing slavery as a fundamental institution. Charleston became a major port for the Atlantic slave trade. Its prosperity built on the forced migration of hundreds of thousands of Africans. Yet, Carolina also became home to one of colonial America's most successful communities of free blacks. In Charleston and the surrounding Low Country, African Americans preserved and adapted their cultural traditions, creating a unique Gullah culture that maintained connections to African languages, crafts, and spiritual practices. Rice cultivation, introduced by enslaved Africans who possessed sophisticated knowledge of irrigation and farming techniques, became a cornerstone of Carolina's economy. As the 18th century dawned, these diverse colonial societies were beginning to discover common ground. Merchants in Boston found markets for their ships and rum in Virginia tobacco ports. Pennsylvania wheat-fed plantation slaves in the Carolinas. New York's strategic location made it a hub for intercolonial trade. Slowly, gradually, an American economy was emerging that bound the colonies together in networks of mutual dependence. This growing commercial integration was accompanied by the spread of ideas. Newspapers, still primitive by later standards, began to circulate between colonies. The first colonial newspaper, Benjamin Harris's Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic, lasted only one issue before Massachusetts authorities shut it down in 1690. But the appetite for information and debate could not be suppressed forever. By 1704, the Boston Newsletter had become the first successful colonial newspaper, followed by papers in other major cities. These publications created a shared conversation among colonists who had never met, but who increasingly saw themselves as part of a common enterprise. When a smallpox epidemic struck Boston, readers in Charleston learned of it. When pirates threatened Carolina shipping, merchants in Philadelphia took notice. Religious revivals also created bonds that transcended colonial boundaries. The Great Awakening of the 1730s and 1740s sent evangelical fervor sweeping through all the colonies. George Whitefield, the English preacher whose dramatic sermons could move thousands to tears, traveled from Georgia to Massachusetts, drawing enormous crowds wherever he appeared. Benjamin Franklin, that most rational of men, found himself contributing to Whitefield's cause, despite his skepticism about emotional religion. The revival movement challenged established religious authorities and promoted the radical notion that individual conscience mattered more than clerical hierarchy. When ordinary farmers and craftsmen claimed direct spiritual authority, they were implicitly challenging other forms of hierarchy as well. The same spirit that questioned the authority of bishops might eventually question the authority of kings. The year 1754 brought war to the American frontier, though few could have predicted how profoundly this conflict would alter the relationship between Britain and her American colonies. The French and Indian War, as colonists called it, began with skirmishes in the Ohio Valley but grew into a global conflict that would reshape the map of North America and plant the seeds of revolution. A young Virginia colonel named George Washington first tasted battle in this war, leading a small force to confront French encroachment on land claimed by his colony. His defeat at Fort Necessity in July 1754 marked an inauspicious beginning to a military career that would ultimately change the world. Yet even in defeat, Washington demonstrated the qualities that would later make him indispensable to the American cause: courage under fire, resilience in the face of setbacks, and an unshakable commitment to duty. The war that followed tested colonial society in unprecedented ways. Benjamin Franklin, already renowned as a printer and inventor, proposed the Albany Plan of Union in 1754, calling for colonial cooperation in matters of defense and governance. Though the plan was rejected by both colonial assemblies and the British government, it planted ideas that would later flourish. Franklin's famous political cartoon, Join or Die, depicting a snake cut into pieces representing the colonies, became one of America's first symbols of unity, as British and colonial forces struggled against French and Native American allies. The conflict revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of imperial governance. British generals, trained in European warfare, often found themselves baffled by forest fighting when Native American tactics proved superior to traditional military formations. Colonial militias, dismissed by British officers as undisciplined rabble, proved their worth in campaigns that required local knowledge and adaptive strategies. The turning point came with the British capture of Quebec in 1759, where both commanding generals Britons James Wolfe and Francis Marquis de Montcalm died in the battle that secured British control of Canada. By 1763, the Treaty of Paris had eliminated French power from North America east of the Mississippi River. Britain stood triumphant, master of a vast North American empire that stretched from Hudson Bay to the Gulf of Mexico. Yet victory brought unexpected consequences. The war had cost Britain an enormous sum. The national debt had doubled, and Parliament faced the challenge of governing and defending territories that had tripled in size. More troubling still, colonial participation in the war had revealed uncomfortable truths about the nature of imperial authority. Colonial assemblies had raised armies, levied taxes, and governed themselves with an independence that some in London found alarming. The Proclamation of 1763, which forbade colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, marked the beginning of a new phase in British-American relations. intended to prevent costly conflicts with Native American tribes. The proclamation struck many colonists as a betrayal of their sacrifice during the war. Veterans who had fought for the Ohio Valley found themselves barred from settling the very lands they had helped secure. More consequential still was Britain's decision to maintain a standing army in America during peacetime. 10,000 troops would be stationed in the colonies, ostensibly for defense, but increasingly seen by colonists as instruments of imperial control. The presence of redcoat soldiers in Boston, New York, and other cities created daily friction between military authority and civilian population. It was in this atmosphere of rising tension that George Grenville, Britain's Chancellor of the introduced the Sugar Act of 1764. This seemingly modest measure lowered the tax on molasses imported from non-British islands, but strengthened enforcement mechanisms and expanded the jurisdiction of admiralty courts. Colonial merchants who had grown accustomed to evading customs duties through smuggling suddenly found themselves facing vigorous prosecution. The Sugar Act's impact went beyond its immediate economic effects. By transferring jurisdiction over customs cases from local courts with colonial juries to admiralty courts with appointed judges, the act challenged fundamental assumptions about legal rights. James Otis of Massachusetts, a lawyer whose mind combined legal precision with passionate oratory, declared that taxation without representation violated the basic principles of English liberty. But it was the Stamp Act of 1765 that truly ignited colonial resistance. This measure required tax stamps on virtually every piece of printed matter in the colony's newspapers. Legal documents, playing cards, almanacs, even dice. Unlike previous taxes that affected mainly merchants, the Stamp Act touched every level of colonial society. Lawyers found their practice taxed, printers saw their livelihood threatened, and ordinary citizens faced additional costs for basic legal transactions. The colonial response exceeded anything British officials had anticipated. In Virginia, Patrick Henry introduced resolutions in the House of Burgesses, declaring that only colonial assemblies had the right to tax colonists. Though some of Henry's most radical resolves were rejected, newspapers throughout America published all of them, creating the impression that Virginia had taken a more extreme position than it actually had. Henry's speech became the stuff of legend, though accounts of his exact words varied. Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, he allegedly declared, and George III may profit by their example. Whether he actually spoke these treasonous words, or whether they were the creation of later myth-makers, the story captured the defiant spirit that was spreading through the colonies in Massachusetts. Samuel Adams proved himself a master of political organization, a failed businessman who found his true calling in revolutionary politics. Adams understood that resistance required more than fiery speeches. It needed careful coordination and sustained pressure. He helped organize the Sons of Liberty, a network of activists who used both legal protest and intimidation to resist British policies. The Sons of Liberty made their presence felt throughout the colonies. In Boston, they hung an effigy of Andrew Oliver, the designated stamp distributor, from the Liberty Tree and forced his resignation. In New York, they destroyed the house of Lieutenant Governor Cadwallader Colden when he attempted to enforce the act. By the time November 1st, 1765, arrived the date the Stamp Act was to take effect, not a single stamp distributor remained in office throughout the American colonies. More significant than mob action was the Stamp Act Congress, which convened in New York in October 1765. 9 colonies sent delegates to this unprecedented gathering, where representatives debated colonial rights and crafted a unified response to British taxation. The Congress's Declaration of Rights and Grievances articulated principles that would echo through the Revolutionary era, that colonists possessed the rights of Englishmen, that taxation without representation violated those rights, and that only colonial assemblies could legitimately tax the colonists. The economic impact of colonial resistance proved decisive. Merchants throughout America agreed to boycott British goods until the Stamp Act was repealed. Ships returned to England with empty holds, while warehouses in London filled with unsold merchandise. British manufacturers, facing ruined export markets, added their voices to calls for repeal in March 1766. Parliament reluctantly repealed the Stamp Act, but simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to tax the colonies in all cases whatsoever. While colonists celebrated the repeal with bonfires and toasts to King George III, few paid attention to the Declaratory Act's ominous language. The fundamental constitutional question whether Parliament had the right to tax Americans who were not represented in that body remained unresolved. The cycle of provocation and resistance soon resumed. In 1767, Charles Townshend, the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, introduced duties on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea imported into the colonies. Unlike the Stamp Act, these were external taxes on trade rather than internal taxes on transactions. Addressing one of the colonists' legal objections, Townshend also used revenue from these duties to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges, making these officials independent of colonial assemblies for the first time. The Townshend Acts provoked another round of resistance, but this time the opposition was more sophisticated and sustained. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania published Letters from a Farmer, a series of essays that circulated throughout the colonies and provided intellectual ammunition for resistance. Dickinson argued that Britain could regulate trade but could not tax for revenue, a distinction that most British officials found artificial but that many colonists embraced. Boston, in the winter of 1770, simmered with tensions that had been building for months. British soldiers, quartered in the city since 1768 to enforce the Townshend Acts, found themselves increasingly isolated among a hostile population. The Redcoats competed with local men for jobs during off-duty hours, adding economic rivalry to political resentment. Incidents between soldiers and civilians had become almost daily occurrences. On the evening of March 5, 1770, these tensions finally erupted in King Street. A crowd gathered around a British sentry, taunting him with snowballs and curses. When Captain Thomas Preston arrived with reinforcements, the situation spiraled beyond control. In the confusion and fear that followed, shots were fired, and 5 colonists lay dead or dying in the snow. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a sailor of mixed African and Native American ancestry whose death made him one of the first martyrs of American liberty. Samuel Adams, ever alert to the political possibilities of tragedy, dubbed the incident the Boston Massacre and ensured that news of the killings spread throughout the colonies. Paul Revere's engraving of the event, though wildly inaccurate in its details, crystallized colonial outrage in a powerful visual image. The picture showed disciplined British soldiers firing on helpless civilians of propaganda, masterpiece that inflamed anti-British sentiment far beyond Boston. Yet even in this moment of crisis, the American commitment to legal process revealed itself. John Adams, cousin to Samuel but more cautious in temperament, agreed to defend Captain Preston and his soldiers in court. Adams risked his reputation and career by taking the case, but he believed that even British soldiers deserved fair representation. His successful defense, which resulted in Preston's acquittal and light sentences for his men, demonstrated that American anger could be channeled through legal institutions rather than mob violence. The Boston Massacre prompted another British retreat. Lord North's government repealed most of the townshend duties, retaining only the tax on tea as a symbol of parliamentary authority. For a brief moment, it seemed that cooler heads might prevail. Trade resumed. Colonial newspapers focused on other matters, and the revolutionary fervor of the late 1760s appeared to subside. This period of relative calm lasted nearly 3 years. But beneath the surface, important changes were occurring. Committees of correspondence, first established by Samuel Adams in Massachusetts, created networks of communication that linked towns and colonies in unprecedented ways. These committees shared information about British policies, coordinated resistance efforts, and gradually built the infrastructure of revolution. The calm shattered in 1773 when Parliament passed the Tea Act, a measure intended to save the financially troubled East India Company by allowing it to sell tea directly to American retailers, bypassing colonial merchants. Though the act actually lowered the price of tea for consumers, it threatened to destroy the livelihood of American tea merchants and reinforced the hated principle of taxation without representation. Colonial resistance to the Tea Act was swift and decisive. In New York and Philadelphia, tea ships were turned away before they could unload their cargo. In Charleston, the tea was seized and stored in government warehouses. But in Boston, where Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to grant clearance for the ships to leave, the confrontation reached its climax. On the evening of December 16, 1773, thousands of Bostonians gathered at Old South Meeting House to debate what to do about the 3 tea ships moored in the harbor. When word came that Hutchinson still refused to let the ships depart, Samuel Adams declared, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." It was a prearranged signal for action that had been planned for weeks. What followed became known as the Boston Tea Party, though it was neither spontaneous nor celebratory. Men disguised as Mohawk Indians, masquerade that provided anonymity while mockingly appropriating the identity of people considered outside British law, boarded the ships and methodically dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. The operation was disciplined and purposeful. Nothing else was damaged, and one broken padlock was replaced the next day. The destruction of the tea represented property damage worth thousands of pounds, but its symbolic value far exceeded its monetary cost. Here was a direct challenge to British authority that could not be ignored. Lord North's government, under pressure from King George III to take a firm stand, responded with what colonists called the Intolerable Acts and what the British termed the Coercive Acts. The Coercive Acts of 1774 were designed to isolate Massachusetts and demonstrate the consequences of defying British authority. The Boston Port Act closed Boston Harbor until the city paid for the destroyed tea. The Massachusetts Government Act revoked the colony's charter and placed it under direct royal control. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in England rather than colonial courts. The Quartering Act authorized military commanders to house soldiers in private homes if necessary, rather than isolating Massachusetts. However, the Coercive Acts had the opposite effect. Colonists throughout America saw in Boston's punishment a preview of what might happen to them if they continued to resist British policies. Virginia's House of Burgesses declared a day of fasting and prayer for their suffering brethren in Boston. South Carolina sent rice to feed the unemployed dock workers of the closed port. Even conservative colonists who had disapproved of the Tea Party began to question whether British rule was compatible with American liberty. The crisis deepened when General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, attempted to seize colonial military supplies stored in Concord. On the night of April 18, 1775, Gage sent a column of soldiers across the Charles River and down the road toward Lexington and Concord. But colonial intelligence networks, perfected through years of resistance, had detected the movement. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Dr. Samuel Prescott rode through the countryside, warning that the regulars are coming out. At dawn on April 19, 1775, British troops encountered a small group of colonial militia on Lexington Green. Captain John Parker, commanding the Americans, allegedly told his men, "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." In the confused moments that followed, shots were fired, the shot heard round the world, that Ralph Waldo Emerson would later immortalize in verse. The British column continued to Concord, where they found most of the military supplies had been removed. But as they began their return march to Boston, the countryside erupted in resistance. Hundreds of colonial militiamen, responding to alarm calls that echoed across the Massachusetts countryside, harassed the retreating British force from behind stone walls and trees. By the time the bloodied column reached the safety of Boston, the American Revolution had begun. Word of Lexington and Concord spread through the colonies with extraordinary speed. Within days, express riders had carried the news as far south as Georgia. Colonial newspapers printed eyewitness accounts that portrayed the British as aggressors who had fired on peaceful citizens. The narrative of British tyranny and American innocence, carefully cultivated through years of political resistance, now had its first martyrs and its first battlefield as spring turned to summer in 1775. Representatives from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. This body, which had no legal authority under British law, but commanded growing allegiance from colonial populations, faced the enormous task of coordinating resistance to the world's most powerful empire. Among the delegates were men whose names would become synonymous with American independence. John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, George Washington of Virginia, and Thomas Jefferson, a young lawyer from the Virginia Piedmont, whose gift for words would soon reshape the political world. The echoes of discontent grew louder with each passing season, rippling through cobblestone streets and across farmland borders like thunder before a storm. In the coffee houses of Boston and the taverns of Philadelphia, voices that had once whispered now spoke with growing boldness. The merchants who had watched their profits diminish under the weight of new taxes found common cause with craftsmen whose livelihoods hung in the balance. What had begun as isolated protests was crystallizing into something far more powerful as shared understanding that the relationship between mother country and colonies had shifted beyond recognition. The Sons of Liberty, those shadowy figures who moved through the darkness of colonial towns, had evolved from a loose collection of malcontents into an organized network of resistance. Their meetings, held in the back rooms of taverns and the basements of homes, hummed with the energy of men who had found their purpose. Samuel Adams, his weathered face etched with the determination of a born revolutionary, moved through these gatherings like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of rebellion. His words carried weight not because of his position or wealth, for he had little of either, but because they spoke to something deeper than immediate grievances. They spoke to the soul of a people who were beginning to understand what they might become in Virginia. The plantation houses that dotted the James River Valley bore witness to their own quiet revolution. Here, among men who had grown wealthy on tobacco and land, the conversation took on different tones but reached similar conclusions. Patrick Henry's voice, when he rose to speak in the House of Burgesses, carried the cadence of a preacher and the fire of a prophet. His words about liberty and death would echo through history. But in that moment, they simply expressed what many felt but could not articulate, that something fundamental had changed in the relationship between ruler and ruled. The year 1770 arrived with winter's bite still sharp in the air, and with it came an incident that would sear itself into the collective memory of a continent. Boston, that restless port city where merchants and laborers rubbed shoulders in narrow streets, had become a powder keg waiting for a spark. British soldiers, red-coated and far from home, walked patrols through streets where they were neither wanted nor welcomed. The presence of these troops, quartered in the city under the terms of laws the colonists had never agreed to, created a tension that grew thicker with each passing day. On the evening of March 5th, as snow began to fall and lamplight flickered, against the darkness, a crowd gathered near the Custom House on King Street. What began as taunts and thrown snowballs escalated with the inexorable logic of mob psychology. The soldiers, young men far from their English villages, faced a hostile crowd whose anger had been building for months. In the confusion and fear of that snowy evening, muskets fired. When the smoke cleared and the crowd dispersed, 5 colonists lay dead in the snow, their blood dark against the white ground. The Boston Massacre, as it would come to be known, provided something that the resistance movement had been lacking. Crispus Attucks, a man of mixed African and Native American heritage, who had worked the docks and ships of Boston Harbor, became the first to die for American liberty, though that word had not yet taken on its full meaning. The propaganda value of the incident was not lost on men like Samuel Adams, who understood that sometimes perception matters more than truth, and that a skilled writer could shape the narrative in ways that served the cause of resistance. Paul Revere, silversmith, an engraver, created an image of the massacre that spread through the colonies like wildfire. His engraving showed British soldiers firing in formation into a crowd of innocent civilians, a depiction that bore little resemblance to the chaotic reality of that snowy evening but perfectly captured the emotional truth of how many colonists had come to view their relationship with Britain. The image appeared in newspapers and broadsides, creating a shared understanding of grievance that transcended regional boundaries. In the aftermath of the shooting, something remarkable happened. John Adams, cousin to Samuel, but possessed of a different temperament and philosophy, agreed to defend the British soldiers in court. This decision, which could have destroyed his reputation and career, spoke to principles that would later find expression in the founding documents of a new nation. Adams believed that even unpopular defendants deserved competent legal representation, that justice should not be sacrificed to popular passion, and that a society of laws must protect the rights of all, even those it despises. The trial that followed became a testament to the legal principles that the colonists claimed to cherish. Adams argued successfully that most of the soldiers had acted in self-defense, and that the crowd had indeed been threatening. Only 2 soldiers were convicted of manslaughter, and they received the relatively light punishment of having their thumbs branded. The outcome satisfied neither the patriots who wanted blood, nor the loyalists who saw the soldiers as innocent victims of mob violence but it established something more important than vengeance. It demonstrated that even in the midst of political crisis, the rule of law could prevail over the rule of passion. The months that followed the Boston Massacre saw a strange calm descend over the colonies, like the quiet that comes before a thunderstorm. The British government, recognizing that their policies had pushed the colonists to the edge of revolt, repealed most of the hated Townshend Acts. Only the tax on tea remained, a symbolic assertion of parliamentary authority that seemed small, enough to ignore for a time. It appeared that the crisis might pass, that accommodation might be found between the demands of empire and the aspirations of colonists who simply wanted to be left alone to pursue their commerce and their dreams. But beneath this surface calm, deeper currents continued to flow. The networks of correspondence that had been established during the height of the crisis did not disappear with the repeal of the taxes. Instead, they evolved into something more sophisticated and far-reaching. Committees of correspondence, organized primarily through the efforts of Samuel Adams and his allies, created a communication system that linked the 13 colonies in ways that had never existed before. Letters traveled along post roads and ship routes, carrying news, ideas, and shared grievances from Georgia to New Hampshire. This network would prove its worth when the British government made a decision that seemed minor at the time, but would have consequences that no one could have foreseen. The East India Company, that massive commercial enterprise that was the economic backbone of British power in Asia, found itself in financial difficulties. The company had warehouses full of tea that it could not sell profitably, and it faced the prospect of bankruptcy unless the British government intervened. The solution that Parliament devised seemed elegant in its simplicity: give the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in America, allowing it to sell directly to retailers and bypass the colonial merchants who had traditionally handled the trade. The Tea Act of 1773 did not increase taxes on tea. Indeed, it might have made tea cheaper for colonial consumers, but it struck at something far more important than the price of tea. Colonial merchants, who had built their fortunes on trade and commerce, suddenly found themselves cut out of one of the most profitable trades. The act represented a form of economic favoritism that threatened the very foundation of colonial commercial life. If Parliament could arbitrarily grant monopolies to favored companies, what was to stop them from doing the same with other trades? The freedom to engage in commerce, which many colonists saw as fundamental to their liberty, suddenly seemed far less secure when the first ships laden with East India Company tea arrived in American ports. They met resistance that surprised everyone with its intensity and organization. In New York and Philadelphia, the ships were turned away before they could unload their cargo. In Charleston, the tea was unloaded but then locked away in warehouses where it would eventually rot. But it was in Boston, that city which had already earned a reputation for resistance, that the confrontation reached its climax. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, sat anchored in Boston Harbor as December 1773 drew to a close. Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor of Massachusetts, refused to grant the ships clearance to leave without paying the required duties. The ship's captains, caught between the governor's demands and the threats of the Sons of Liberty, found themselves trapped in an impossible situation. For weeks, the ships sat in the harbor while meetings were held and ultimatums issued. The entire city seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how the standoff would resolve. On the evening of December 16th, as a cold rain began to fall, several thousand colonists gathered at Old South Meeting House to hear the final appeal to the governor. When word came that Hutchinson had again refused to let the ships depart, a voice from the crowd called out that nothing more could be done to save the country. It was then that men disguised as Mohawk Indians, though their disguises fooled, no one made their way through the streets toward Griffin's Wharf. What happened next took on the quality of ritual rather than mere destruction. The men who boarded the 3 ships worked with careful precision, breaking open the chests of tea and dumping their contents into the harbor. They swept the decks clean when they were finished, and even replaced a padlock that had been accidentally broken. No other property was destroyed, and when one participant was caught trying to steal tea for himself, he was roughly expelled from the group. This was not random violence or looting, it was a carefully orchestrated act of political theater designed to send a message that could not be misunderstood. The destruction of 342 chests of tea, valued at approximately £10,000, sent shockwaves through the British government. The Boston Tea Party, as it would come to be known, represented something far more dangerous than mere tax resistance. It was an organized rejection of British authority, carried out with the apparent support of the population. The carefully controlled nature of the destruction made it clear that this was not the work of a mob, but of a disciplined opposition that could mobilize and act with precision. The British response to the Boston Tea Party came swiftly and with a fury that surprised even those who had expected retaliation. King George III, that stubborn monarch who would later be remembered for losing an empire, saw the destruction of the tea as a direct challenge to his authority that could not go unpunished. The British Parliament, already frustrated by years of colonial resistance, passed a series of acts in 1774 that the colonists immediately dubbed the Intolerable Acts. These laws were designed not merely to punish Boston, but to serve as an example to the other colonies of what would happen to those who defied British authority. The Boston Port Act closed Boston Harbor to all commerce until the destroyed tea was paid for, effectively strangling the economic life of New England's most important city. The Massachusetts Government Act revoked the colony's charter and placed it under direct royal control, stripping away rights of self-governance that had been established for generations. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in England rather than in colonial courts, creating what colonists saw as a system of legal immunity for those who oppressed them. The Quartering Act required colonists to house British soldiers in their homes, violating what many considered the sacred boundary between public authority and private life. These acts, intended to isolate Boston and cow the other colonies into submission, had precisely the opposite effect. The committees of correspondence that had been established during the earlier crises now carried urgent messages throughout the continent. From Charleston to Portsmouth, from Savannah to Albany, the same questions were being asked. If Parliament could destroy the rights of Massachusetts today, what was to stop them from destroying the rights of Virginia or Pennsylvania tomorrow? The punishment of Boston was seen not as justice, but as a preview of what all the colonies might expect if they continued to resist British policies in Virginia. The House of Burgesses declared a day of fasting and prayer in sympathy with Boston. The royal governor, infuriated by this act of solidarity, dissolved the assembly. But the Burgesses simply reconvened in the Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg, where they issued a call for a general congress of all the colonies. Similar calls were heard from New York, Pennsylvania, and the other colonies. For the first time since the aborted Albany Congress of 1754, representatives from all 13 colonies would gather to consider their common interests and common grievances. The first, Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in September 1774, bringing together men who had heard of each other but had never met face to face. George Washington rode north from Mount Vernon, his quiet dignity and obvious competence marking him as a natural leader even among this gathering of exceptional men. John Adams traveled down from Massachusetts, his brilliant legal mind and passionate commitment to colonial rights making him one of the most effective voices for resistance. From South Carolina came John Rutledge, representing the interests of the rice and indigo planters who were beginning to understand that their economic future was tied to the cause of colonial rights. The delegates who gathered in Carpenter's Hall represented different regions, different economic interests, and different approaches to the crisis with Britain. Some, like Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania, still hoped for reconciliation and proposed plans that would give the colonies a formal place within the British system while maintaining their connection to the Empire. Others, particularly the Massachusetts delegation, led by Samuel Adams, had moved far beyond thoughts of accommodation and were beginning to envision a complete break with Britain. The debates that filled those autumn days in Philadelphia revealed the complexity of the colonial position. Many delegates were reluctant to take steps that might lead to war, understanding that a conflict with Britain would pit a collection of loosely connected colonies against the most powerful empire in the world. Yet they also recognized that the alternative submission to policies they considered tyrannical was equally unacceptable. The Congress spent weeks crafting documents that walked this delicate line, asserting colonial rights while still professing loyalty to the Crown. The Suffolk Resolves, drafted by Joseph Warren in Massachusetts and endorsed by the Congress, declared the Intolerable Acts unconstitutional and urged Massachusetts to form its own government until the acts were repealed. The Declaration of Rights and Grievances listed colonial complaints against British policy going back more than a decade. Most significantly, the Congress agreed to implement a comprehensive boycott of British goods, enforced by local committees throughout the colonies. This Continental Association, as it was called, created the first truly effective united colonial action against British policy. As the delegates prepared to return to their home colonies in October 1774, they agreed to reconvene the following May if their grievances had not been addressed. Few believed that the British government would make the concessions necessary to avoid such a second Congress. The die, as Julius Caesar had said long ago when crossing the Rubicon, appeared to be cast. The colonies had united in opposition to British policy in ways that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. What remained to be seen was whether this unity would hold when the ultimate test came, whether these 13 distinct colonies would be willing to fight together for their shared vision of liberty. As winter gave way to spring in 1775, the countryside around Boston took on the quiet tension of a place where everyone knows that violence is coming, but no one knows exactly when or how it will arrive. British General Thomas Gage, military governor of Massachusetts, found himself in an impossible position. His orders from London were clear: restore order and British authority in the rebellious colony. But his resources were limited, and every move he made seemed only to strengthen colonial resistance. His troops, now numbering several thousand, were effectively besieged in Boston by a hostile population that watched their every movement and reported their activities to the provincial government that had replaced the royal authority throughout the Massachusetts countryside. Militia companies drilled on village greens with an intensity that had not been seen since the French and Indian War. These were not the casual musters of peacetime, where farmers gathered once a month to share news and perhaps fire a few rounds at targets. These were serious military preparations conducted by men who understood that they might soon face British regulars in actual combat. The Minutemen, as the most dedicated of these militia units called themselves, practiced rapid deployment and guerrilla tactics that would allow them to harass British forces while avoiding the kind of fixed battle that would play to British strengths. The provincial government, led by men like John Hancock and Samuel Adams, operated in a strange twilight zone between legality and rebellion. They collected taxes, organized military forces, and governed the colony in all but name, while officially maintaining that they were loyal subjects of the crown who were simply defending their rights against tyrannical ministers. This fiction grew harder to maintain with each passing day, as the distance between their actions and their professed loyalty became impossible to ignore. General Gage understood that he needed to act before the colonial military preparations became too advanced to counter. Intelligence reports told him that the colonists were stockpiling weapons and gunpowder in the inland town of Concord, about 20 miles from Boston. A swift strike to destroy these supplies might demonstrate British power while depriving the colonists of the means to resist. On the night of April 18, 1775, Gage ordered Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith to march to Concord with about 700 British regulars to carry out this mission. The British attempt at secrecy failed almost immediately. The network of watchers and messengers that the colonists had established meant that news of the British movement spread through the countryside within hours. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott rode through the darkness, warning militia companies and rousing the countryside. By dawn, when the British column reached Lexington Green, they found Captain John Parker and about 70 militiamen waiting for them. What happened next on that April morning would be debated by historians for centuries. The British forces, led by Major John Pitcairn, ordered the militiamen to disperse. Parker, realizing that his small force could not hope to stand against 700 regulars, ordered his men to withdraw. But in the confusion and tension of that moment, a shot was fired by whom no one could say with certainty. In the volley that followed, 8 colonists died and 10 were wounded. The British suffered only one minor wound, but something far more significant had been lost. The blood that stained Lexington Green ended any possibility of peaceful resolution to the growing crisis. The British column continued to Concord, where they found that most of the military supplies had already been removed or hidden. A small skirmish at Concord's North Bridge resulted in the first British casualties of what would become the Revolutionary War. But it was on the long march back to Boston that the true nature of the conflict that was beginning became clear. Colonial militiamen, operating in small groups and using tactics learned from decades of frontier warfare, harassed the British column from behind stone walls, trees, and buildings. The orderly retreat became a running battle that stretched across 20 miles of Massachusetts countryside. By the time the battered British column reached the safety of Boston, they had suffered 273 casualties compared to 95 for the colonists. More importantly, they had learned that they were not facing a simple police action against a discontented population, but a genuine military challenge from a people prepared to fight for their beliefs. The mythology of British military invincibility, built up over decades of victories in Europe and around the world, had suffered its first serious blow in the forests and fields of New England. News of Lexington and Concord spread through the colonies with extraordinary speed. Within days, militia companies throughout New England were marching toward Boston to join what was rapidly becoming a siege of the British forces there. From Connecticut came Nathanael Greene, a young Quaker whose military genius would later prove crucial to American success. From New Hampshire marched John Stark, a veteran of the French and Indian War who understood both the capabilities and limitations of militia forces. From Rhode Island came a motley collection of merchants, farmers, and fishermen united only in their determination to drive the British from New England. The siege of Boston that began in the aftermath of Lexington and Concord created a strange situation that neither side had expected or planned for. The British Army, one of the finest military forces in the world, found itself trapped in a city by a collection of colonial militia units that lacked uniforms, standard equipment, or formal military training. Yet these farmers and craftsmen had done something that no European army had managed in living memory. They had effectively neutralized British military power in an entire region as spring turned to summer in 1775. Both sides struggled to understand what they had gotten themselves into. The British government, thousands of miles away in London, found it difficult to comprehend that their colonial subjects had not only taken up arms against royal authority, but had shown themselves capable of effective military action. The colonists, for their part, discovered that there was no easy way back from the line they had crossed on Lexington Green. The blood that had been shed there had created its own momentum, carrying them toward a confrontation that few had wanted, but from which there now seemed no escape. In the camps around Boston, men who had left their farms and shops, expecting to be away for a few weeks, found themselves part of something much larger and more permanent than they had anticipated. They were no longer simply defending their local communities against British tyranny. They were becoming the army of a revolution that had not yet been formally declared but was already changing the course of history. The founding of the United States had begun not with grand declarations or formal ceremonies, but with the simple decision of ordinary men to stand their ground when confronted with what they considered intolerable oppression. The winter winds carried more than snow across the Delaware River that December night in 1776. They carried the whispered prayers of men who had seen their cause nearly die, who had watched their fellow soldiers march away when their enlistments expired, leaving behind only footprints in the frost and the echo of what might have been. George Washington stood at the bow of the lead boat, his figure cutting through the darkness like a monument to determination itself, while chunks of ice knocked against the wooden hull with the sound of time-marking moments that would either birth a nation or bury a dream beneath the cold waters of history. Behind him, in boats that creaked and groaned against the current, sat the remnants of the Continental Army farmers and merchants, blacksmiths and clerks, men whose names would never grace the pages of history books, but whose courage would write the first chapter of American independence. Their breath formed clouds in the frigid air as they pulled against oars made heavy by ice and hope, each stroke carrying them closer to Trenton, where Hessian soldiers slept in warm quarters, confident that no army would dare cross a river in such weather, that no general would risk everything on such a desperate gamble. The crossing took 9 hours. 9 hours of fighting against ice and wind and the dark voice of doubt that whispered to every man that this was folly, that they should turn back while they still could. But Washington had learned that retreat was not always safety, that sometimes the only path to survival lay through the heart of danger itself. He had watched his army shrink from 30,000 to fewer than 3,000, had seen the British march triumphantly through New York while his men fled like shadows before the dawn. Now, on this longest night of the year, he would either resurrect his cause or bury it with honor. The surprise at Trenton came with the sound of footsteps in snow, the sudden appearance of American soldiers at every street corner like spirits, materializing from the storm. The Hessians, roused from sleep by the unfamiliar sound of English commands and the rattle of musket fire, stumbled into a dawn they had never expected to see. In 45 minutes, it was over. 900 prisoners, vast supplies of weapons and food, and most precious of all, the restoration of something that had been bleeding away through the autumn months, the belief that victory was possible. News of Trenton traveled like fire through winter-dry grass, reaching the coffeehouse philosophers of Philadelphia and the farmhouse hearths of Virginia with equal swiftness. Men who had begun to speak of reconciliation suddenly found their voices raised again in defiance. Women who had hidden their silver from British foragers began to melt it down for bullets. Children who had grown accustomed to whispered conversations about politics heard their parents speak again with the clear tones of conviction. The winter that followed tested more than bodies. It tested the very soul of revolution. Valley Forge became a name that would echo through generations, not because of any great battle fought there, but because of a different kind of victory, the victory of endurance over despair, of purpose, over comfort, of tomorrow over today. 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia, where the British Army slept in warm beds and dined on fresh provisions, the Continental Army settled into huts hastily built from logs and mud, preparing to face months of cold that would prove more formidable than any enemy they had yet encountered. The soldiers arrived at Valley Forge in December 1777, their feet leaving bloody prints in the snow, their uniforms reduced to rags that fluttered like prayer flags in the winter wind. Some wrapped their feet in scraps of blanket, others in strips, torn from their own clothing, while still others left their footprints, dark against the white ground with nothing but calloused skin between them and the frozen earth. They had fought the British to a standstill at Brandywine and Germantown, but victory in battle meant little when victory in winter remained uncertain. In the huts they built 12 men to a dwelling, walls chinked with mud and moss, roofs that leaked melted snow onto straw bedding. They discovered what it meant to transform suffering into strength. They learned to stretch a daily ration of fire cake and water soup into something resembling nourishment, to find warmth in shared stories and songs that reminded them why they had come so far from home. They learned to trust in each other when trust in everything else seemed foolish, to find hope in the morning's roll call when each name answered was a small victory over the night's attempt to claim another life. Friedrich von Steuben arrived in February like an answer to prayers that had been whispered in a dozen different languages by men who shared little beyond their commitment to an idea that had not yet taken full shape in their minds. The Prussian officer, with his carefully waxed moustache and his translator always at his side, brought something the Continental Army had never possessed, the knowledge of how to transform a collection of brave individuals into a unified fighting force. He watched them drill on the packed snow of the parade ground, these Americans who had learned warfare through necessity rather than instruction, and saw beneath their ragged appearance the raw material of professional soldiers. Through the remaining weeks of winter, von Steuben's voice carried across the camp, sometimes in French, sometimes in German, often in exasperated English, as he taught men who had been fighting for 3 years how to march in step, how to load and fire in coordinated volleys, how to advance and retreat not as individuals but as units that moved with the precision of clockwork. He taught them to see themselves not merely as patriots but as soldiers, not merely as Americans but as an army worthy of the nation they were fighting to create. Martha Washington arrived in winter's depth, joining the small community of wives who had chosen to share their husband's exile from comfort. She moved through the camp like a gentle spirit, visiting the sick, organizing the women in mending uniforms and caring for the wounded, bringing to that place of suffering a reminder of the homes and families for which they fought. Her presence transformed the crude huts into something approaching a community, her quiet dignity serving as a counterpoint to the harsh realities of military life. In the evenings, she could be found in the commander's quarters, where Washington worked by candlelight over correspondence that carried the weight of a nation's future, her needle moving steadily through the cloth as she mended the tears that war had made in more than just fabric. The army that emerged from Valley Forge in June 1778 bore little resemblance to the collection of militiamen who had entered that winter cantonment 6 months earlier. They moved with the coordinated precision of veterans, their uniforms still patched but now worn with pride, their weapons maintained with the care of professionals who understood that their tools were extensions of their will. They had learned in that place of trial that endurance was itself a form of victory, that an army's greatest weapon was not always its ability to advance, but sometimes its capacity to remain where it stood when retreat would have been easier. As they marched from their winter quarters toward the promise of spring campaign season, they carried with them more than the memory of hardship survived. They carried the knowledge that they had become something new under the American sun, not Virginians or Pennsylvanians or Massachusetts men, but Americans in the fullest sense, united not merely by geography or grievance, but by shared sacrifice and common purpose. Behind them, the empty huts of Valley Forge stood like monuments to transformation, their silent doors and cold hearths bearing witness to the winter when an idea became an army, when suffering became strength, when endurance became victory. Across the Atlantic Ocean, in the gilded halls of Versailles, where courtiers moved through their daily rituals of protocol and intrigue, news of American victories arrived like seeds carried on favorable winds to fertile ground. King Louis XVI, young and uncertain on a throne still warm from his grandfather's long reign, found himself presented with an opportunity that appealed both to his minister's strategic calculations and his own romantic notions of supporting liberty against tyranny. The American commissioners, Benjamin Franklin foremost among them, had been patient gardeners of French sympathy, cultivating relationships and managing perceptions with the skill of diplomats who understood that nations, like individuals, were moved as much by emotion and pride as by pure self-interest. Franklin, the Philadelphia printer who would become the most famous American in the world, moved through the French court like a master actor playing a role carefully crafted for his audience. His plain brown coat among the silk and velvet of Versailles, his simple manners amid the elaborate ceremonies of monarchy, his scientific reputation in an age that worshipped rational, combined to create an image of American virtue that charmed philosophers and delighted ladies of fashion. He spoke their language fluently, not merely French, but the deeper language of ideas that had made the Enlightenment a transatlantic conversation, presenting the American cause not as mere rebellion, but as the practical application of principles that French thinkers had long advocated in theory. The victory at Saratoga in October 1777 had provided the crucial evidence that French skeptics required proof that the Americans could not merely resist British power, but actually defeat it. In open battle, General John Burgoyne's surrender of his entire army to Horatio Gates had sent shockwaves through European capitals, transforming the American war from what many had seen as a hopeless colonial uprising into a genuine struggle between major powers. In London, Lord North's government suddenly faced the prospect of fighting not merely American rebels, but a coalition that might include the greatest military power on the European continent. The Treaty of Alliance, signed in February 1778, represented more than a diplomatic agreement. It marked the moment when the American Revolution became a world war. France committed not merely to recognize American independence, but to fight until Britain accepted that independence, transforming what had been a colonial rebellion into a global conflict that would stretch from the Caribbean to India, from the waters of the English Channel to the coasts of Africa. For the Americans, French entry into the war brought immediate practical benefits: naval support that could challenge British control of the seas, financial assistance that could sustain their armies, military supplies that could equip their forces, and perhaps most importantly, the knowledge that they no longer stood alone against the world's most powerful empire. The French fleet that arrived in American waters in 1778 under the command of Admiral d'Estaing carried more than ships and men. It carried the visible symbol of European recognition, the tangible proof that the American cause had gained legitimacy in the eyes of the world. When French sailors walked the streets of Newport and Charleston, when French officers took their places beside their American counterparts at staff meetings, when French gold helped pay American soldiers, the revolution gained a new dimension that transformed both its character and its possibilities. Spain's entry into the war the following year, though motivated more by hostility to Britain than affection for American principles, further stretched British resources and opened new theaters of conflict. Spanish forces attacked British positions in Florida and along the Mississippi River, while Spanish gold helped sustain the American war effort and Spanish ports provided safe harbor for American vessels. The Dutch Republic, though more cautious in its commitments, nevertheless provided crucial financial support and opened its Caribbean ports to American trade, creating a complex web of alliances that forced Britain to defend its interests on multiple fronts simultaneously. In America itself, the French alliance brought changes that extended far beyond military assistance. French officers, many of them young volunteers motivated by a mixture of idealism and ambition, brought to the Continental Army not merely professional expertise, but also a different vision of what the new nation might become. The Marquis de Lafayette, barely 20 when he joined Washington's staff, represented this new generation of European supporters who saw in America the fulfillment of Enlightenment ideals. His friendship with Washington became symbolic of the broader alliance, a personal bond that reflected the growing connection between the old world and the new. The presence of French troops and French culture in America during the war years planted seeds of cosmopolitan influence that would continue to grow long after the last battle was fought. American officers who served alongside French colleagues gained exposure to different military traditions and social customs. American political leaders who negotiated with French diplomats acquired experience in international relations that would prove invaluable in the years ahead. American merchants who traded with French suppliers developed commercial relationships that would survive the transition from war to peace. The British strategy that emerged in 1778 reflected a fundamental recalculation of American realities, an acknowledgement that the northern colonies had proven more resistant to royal authority than anyone in London had anticipated. Lord George Germain and his advisors turned their attention southward, toward the Carolinas and Georgia, regions where they believed loyalist sentiment remained stronger and where the social structure of plantation society might prove more amenable to the restoration of royal government. It was a strategy born partly of military logic and partly of wishful thinking. A plan that assumed the South would welcome British liberation from what its architects characterized as Northern Revolutionary tyranny. The capture of Savannah in December 1778 marked the beginning of this Southern campaign, as British forces under Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell overwhelmed American defenses and established the first major foothold in the Lower South since the war's early years. The victory was swift and decisive, accomplished with minimal casualties and maximum psychological impact. Within weeks, British authority had been restored throughout much of Georgia, and Loyalist militias began to emerge from years of cautious silence to reclaim property and settle scores with their Patriot neighbors. Charleston fell to British forces in May 1780 after a siege that demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of the Southern strategy. General Henry Clinton's methodical approach to reducing the city showed British capability at its most professional. With siege lines advanced according to European military doctrine and artillery positioned with mathematical precision, the surrender of General Benjamin Lincoln and nearly 5,000 Continental troops represented the worst American defeat of the war, a catastrophe that seemed to validate British confidence in their new approach. Yet even as Charleston's church bells rang to celebrate the restoration of royal authority, the seeds of future problems were already taking root in the South Carolina countryside. The war that developed in the South bore little resemblance to the conventional campaigns that had characterized the Northern theater. It became a war of neighbors against neighbors, where political differences expressed themselves through personal vendettas and old grievances found new outlets in competing allegiances. Patriot militias, led by men like Francis Marion, Andrew Pickens, and Thomas Sumter, emerged from swamps and mountain valleys to strike at British supply lines and Loyalist strongholds, then disappeared back into familiar terrain where conventional forces could not follow. They fought a war of ambush and raid, of sudden attack and swift withdrawal, turning the very landscape into an ally that British commanders never learned to understand. Lord Cornwallis, who assumed command of British forces in the South following Clinton's return to New York, found himself fighting an enemy that refused to behave according to established military conventions. His victories in conventional battles, Camden in August 1780, where he crushed Horatio Gates's attempt to retake South Carolina, and Guilford Courthouse in March 1781, where he defeated Nathaniel Greene in a hard-fought engagement, proved hollow. Triumphs that left his army weakened and his supply lines vulnerable. Each victory drew him deeper into hostile territory, further from his basis of support, more dependent on local loyalists who proved less numerous and less reliable than British planners had anticipated. Nathaniel Greene, the Rhode Island Quaker, who became the architect of American victory in the South, understood that conventional triumph was less important than strategic exhaustion. He divided his forces, sending Daniel Morgan with the light troops to harass British outposts while keeping the main army just beyond Cornwallis's reach, always retreating when faced with superior force, but never allowing the British to rest or resupply in peace. At Cowpens in January 1781, Morgan's tactical genius produced a victory that became a model for the effective use of American military strength's mobility, marksmanship, and the ability to coordinate regular troops with militia forces in a single battle plan. The victory at Cowpens sent shockwaves through British ranks, demonstrating that American forces could not merely resist British attacks, but could actually destroy entire detachments when conditions favored their style of warfare. Bonasta Tarleton, the aggressive cavalry commander whose Green Dragoons had terrorized Patriot militia throughout the Carolinas, found his force shattered by Morgan's careful deployment of troops in successive defensive lines, each designed to exploit British assumptions about American military capabilities. Greene's subsequent retreat across North Carolina, pursued by Cornwallis through winter rains and across swollen rivers, became known as the Race to the Dan, a strategic withdrawal that demonstrated how retreat could be transformed into victory through careful planning and superior knowledge of local terrain. Each river crossing, each destroyed bridge, each supply depot denied to British forces contributed to the gradual weakening of Cornwallis's army, which found itself hundreds of miles from its base of operations, dependent on a countryside that offered little cooperation and much hostility. The Battle of Guilford Courthouse in March 1781 represented the culmination of Greene's strategy, a tactical defeat that achieved strategic success by forcing Cornwallis to recognize that victory in the South would require resources that Britain could not afford to commit. Though British forces held the field at day's end, they had suffered casualties they could not replace, had gained no significant strategic advantage, and found themselves faced with the prospect of an indefinite campaign against an enemy that grew stronger with each apparent defeat. Cornwallis's decision to march his army to Virginia reflected both the failure of the Southern strategy and the dangerous allure of decisive action in the face of strategic uncertainty. By moving to Virginia, he hoped to strike at what he perceived as the source of Southern resistance, to capture or disperse the political leadership that coordinated Patriot opposition throughout the region. It was a gamble that revealed both his military skill and his fundamental misunderstanding of the revolution he was fighting a movement that drew its strength, not from any single leader or location, but from the widespread conviction that American independence was worth the price that war demanded. The threads of fate that had been weaving themselves across continents and through seasons of war began to converge in the summer of 1781 at a small tobacco port on the Virginia Peninsula, where the York River met the Chesapeake Bay, and history prepared to turn on the fulcrum of a single campaign. Cornwallis, his army reduced but still formidable after the grinding campaigns of the Carolinas, had established his base at Yorktown with the confidence of a general who had never lost a major engagement, who believed that British naval supremacy would guarantee his ability to supply his forces and, if necessary, evacuate them to fight another day. He could not have known that thousands of miles away, a French fleet was already sailing toward the same waters where he planned to await reinforcement, or that, in the camps around New York, Washington was planning a movement that would bring together American and French forces in the greatest combined operation of the war. The plan that emerged from the careful coordination between Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau represented more than military strategy. It embodied the full flowering of the alliance that had transformed the American Revolution from a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. French naval superiority in the Chesapeake, even if temporary, could trap Cornwallis on the peninsula, while a combined army approached by land, creating the conditions for the decisive engagement that had eluded both sides throughout 6 years of war. It required precise timing, careful coordination across vast distances, and the kind of bold strategic vision that had characterized Washington's leadership from the beginning. The march south from New York began in late August with American and French troops moving in parallel columns through New Jersey and Pennsylvania, their destination kept secret from all but the highest commanders. Soldiers who had expected to assault the British fortifications around Manhattan suddenly found themselves walking through landscapes they had never seen, past farmhouses where curious children watched foreign uniforms pass their doors, toward a battle they could not yet imagine. The French troops, resplendent in their white coats and precision drill, marched alongside Continental soldiers whose uniforms bore the patches and repairs of years of campaign, creating a visual symbol of the alliance that had made this moment possible. Washington himself rode between the columns, his attention divided between the countless details of moving 18,000 men across 300 miles of uncertain roads and the larger strategic picture that required the coordination of land and sea forces with a precision that left little room for error. He carried in his mind the knowledge that this might be his last opportunity for decisive victory, that the French fleet's presence in American waters was temporary, that the political will that sustained the revolution in both America and France might not survive another year of inconclusive warfare. The news that reached the marching columns in early September transformed anticipation into certainty. Admiral de Grasse had arrived in the Chesapeake Bay with 28 ships of the line and 3,000 additional French troops, establishing the naval superiority that would make the siege possible. When Admiral Graves arrived from New York with the British fleet, the resulting naval battle on September 5th proved decisive not for its tactical brilliance but for its strategic consequences. Though neither fleet was destroyed, the British withdrawal to New York left de Grasse in control of the bay, sealing Cornwallis's fate as surely as if prison walls had risen around Yorktown. The siege that began in late September followed the methodical patterns of European warfare, with parallels and approaches advanced according to the geometry of military engineering. Artillery positions calculated with mathematical precision, and the gradual tightening of pressure that would eventually make surrender inevitable. Yet beneath the formal structures of 18th century siegecraft lay the raw energy of revolutionary warfare. The knowledge that this engagement might determine whether the United States would achieve the independence for which so many had died, or whether the revolution would collapse into the historical footnote that British leaders had always predicted it, would become dot in the British lines. Cornwallis maintained the dignity and professional competence that had made him one of Britain's most respected generals, even as he recognized that strategic circumstances had reduced his options to a choice between surrender and destruction. His correspondence with Clinton in New York took on an increasingly desperate tone as October advanced and no relief expedition appeared on the horizon. The promised reinforcements, the naval support that might have broken the siege, the coordinated assault that might have saved his army all remained. Promises that could not be fulfilled in time to prevent the inevitable conclusion, the bombardment that began on October 9th, brought to Yorktown the full fury of modern artillery, as American and French guns positioned in carefully constructed batteries sent shot and shell into the British fortifications with a precision and intensity that made defense increasingly impossible. The red-hot shot that set fire to British ships in the harbor, the explosive shells that demolished buildings and fortifications, the constant thunder that made sleep impossible and courage difficult all combined to create conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. On the night of October 14th, American and French assault troops stormed the last two British redoubts that anchored the outer defenses, carrying the positions with a combination of careful planning and desperate courage that exemplified the best qualities of the Allied forces. Alexander Hamilton, leading the American assault, and the Baron de Viermenil, commanding the French attack, achieved their objectives almost simultaneously, opening the way for the final phase of the siege that would bring British resistance to an end. The white flag that appeared above the British lines on October 17th, exactly 4 years after, Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga carried with it the weight of historical inevitability, the recognition that military defeat had become the catalyst for political transformation. Cornwallis's request for terms opened negotiations that would determine not merely the fate of his army, but the future of British policy in America. The final acknowledgement that the rebellion that had begun at Lexington and Concord had grown into a revolution that could no longer be contained by military force. The surrender ceremony on October 19th, with its careful attention to military protocol and diplomatic precedent, provided a formal conclusion to 6 years of warfare, while opening the door to questions about peace that would prove almost as difficult to resolve as the military challenges that had brought the armies to Yorktown, as British troops marched between the lines of their former enemies, laying down their arms to the sound of drums that beat the world turned upside down. They marked the end of one chapter in the American story and the beginning of another that would prove equally challenging and perhaps more consequential for the future of human liberty. The victory had been won, but the silence that followed carried with it questions as vast as the continent itself. In the quiet chambers where once revolution had been planned, now the weight of governance settled like autumn leaves upon the shoulders of those who had dared to dream of independence. The 13 states, bound together by war, now found themselves adrift in the uncertain waters of peace, each pulled by currents of their own making. General Washington, the man who had held an army together through the darkest winters, now faced a different kind of trial. The sword that had carved out liberty must be set aside, and in its place the delicate instruments of statecraft must be taken up. Yet the tools of war had proven simpler than the mechanisms of peace, for in battle there was clarity of purpose, while in governance there were only questions multiplying like shadows at dusk. The Articles of Confederation, hastily crafted in the heat of rebellion, now revealed themselves as fragile as morning mist. They had served their purpose when unity meant survival, when the common enemy provided the gravity that held the scattered states in orbit around a shared cause. But with that enemy vanquished, the centrifugal forces of regional interest began to pull the Confederation apart, each state spinning toward its own concerns like planets freed from their sun. In Massachusetts, the farmers who had fought for liberty found themselves crushed beneath debts they could not pay, their lands seized by courts they could not afford to challenge. Daniel Shays, a veteran of Bunker Hill, led desperate men through the countryside, their muskets aimed not at British soldiers but at American courthouses. The rebellion that bore his name sent tremors through the new nation, for it revealed a troubling truth. Independence from Britain had not guaranteed freedom from oppression, merely changed its source. The currency of one state held no value in another, and merchants found their trade entangled in a web of tariffs and restrictions that made the old navigation acts seem generous by comparison. A ship loaded with grain in Virginia might find its cargo worthless in Pennsylvania, where different coins bore different values and different laws held different sway. The Union existed in name only, a loose confederation of 13 small nations, masquerading as one. In the counting houses of Philadelphia and the Plantations of Virginia, men who had signed their names to revolution now counted the cost of their victory. The debts incurred in fighting the war remained, like ghosts demanding payment from a government that possessed neither the power to tax nor the authority to compel. Foreign creditors looked with skepticism upon a nation that could not pay its bills, while domestic investors watched their bonds become worthless paper, promises made by a government too weak to honor them. Yet beneath this chaos, in the correspondence, Between thoughtful men and the quiet conversations held in taverns and drawing rooms, another revolution was brewing. This one would be fought not with muskets and cannon, but with words and ideas, with the careful architecture of government and the delicate balance of power. James Madison, his slight frame carrying a mind as vast as any library, had spent months studying the histories of failed confederations, seeking in the ruins of ancient leagues the secrets of their collapse. Alexander Hamilton, the young officer who had served at Washington's side, saw with crystal clarity the weaknesses that plagued the Confederation. His letters to friends and allies carried an urgency born of frustration, for he understood that liberty without order was merely another form of chaos, and that chaos inevitably led to despotism. The European powers watched with amusement as the American experiment stumbled, confident that these former colonies would soon come begging for readmission to the imperial fold in Virginia, where the gentle rolling hills had witnessed the birth of many revolutionary ideas. Jefferson's pen continued to craft visions of democracy that outpaced the reality of governance. Yet even he, the poet of liberty, recognized that freedom required structure, that rights needed protection, not merely from foreign tyrants, but from the tyranny of the majority itself. The theories that had fired revolution now faced the test of practical application. George Washington, in his quiet retreat at Mount Vernon, felt the weight of the nation's expectations like chains upon his spirit. Letters arrived daily, pleading for his leadership, his presence, his willingness once again to serve a cause greater than himself. The general who had relinquished power when victory was won now found that true victory remained elusive. The enemy had been British tyranny. The challenge was American liberty, properly ordered. The stories of failure arrived like messengers of doom. In Rhode Island, the state government printed money until it became worthless, creditors fleeing like leaves before an autumn wind. In New York, the state assembly quarreled with the Confederation. Congress over control of customs duties, each claiming authority the other refused to recognize. In the South, where the plantation economy had been devastated by war, planters struggled to rebuild, while their neighbors to the north threatened their interests with talk of abolition. Yet from this disorder, from the very real threat of dissolution, came the energy that would forge a new form of government. The crisis was real, but so was the opportunity. In the drawing rooms of the educated elite and the coffee houses where merchants gathered, conversations turned increasingly toward the necessity of fundamental change. The Articles of Confederation had been an experiment. Now it was time for a new laboratory of democracy. The call went out in the spring of 1787, ostensibly to revise the Articles of Confederation, but carrying within it the seeds of something far more radical. Philadelphia, that cradle of revolution, would once again host the architects of American destiny. The State House, where independence had been declared 11 years before, would witness another birth, though this one would be attended by far less fanfare and far more uncertainty. They came from every corner of the Confederation, these 55 men who would spend a sweltering summer crafting the framework of a nation. Some arrived as reluctant participants, bound by duty rather than enthusiasm. Others came as true believers, convinced that the moment had arrived to create something unprecedented in human history. A republic spanning a continent, a democracy that could endure across generations. Washington's presence lent gravity to the proceedings from the moment he entered the assembly hall. The delegates, many of whom had served under his command or alongside him in the halls of the Continental Congress, understood that his willingness to attend signaled the seriousness of Their task? When they elected him president of the convention, it was both recognition of his stature and acknowledgement that what they contemplated would require the blessing of the one man all America trusted. The windows of the State House were kept closed, despite the heat and the proceedings shrouded in secrecy. What transpired within those walls must remain private, they agreed, for the discussions would be frank and the disagreements sharp. Only in such an atmosphere could they speak freely of the fundamental questions that divided them. How much power should the central government possess? How should the states be represented? What rights were so fundamental that no majority should be permitted to abridge them? Edmund Randolph, speaking for Virginia, presented a plan that would have swept away the Confederation entirely, replacing it with a national government of 3 branches, each checking the power of the others. The audacity of the proposal stunned even those who had come prepared for radical change. This was not revision, but revolution, conducted not in the streets, but in the quiet halls of reasoned debate. James Madison, though young in years, commanded respect through the depth of his preparation and the breadth of his learning. His notebooks filled with observations on the failures of ancient confederations and the theories of Enlightenment philosophers. He spoke with the authority of one who had mapped the territory they must traverse. The Virginia Plan, though bearing Randolph's name, carried Madison's intellectual fingerprints on every clause. But William Paterson of New Jersey rose to challenge this vision, offering a plan that would preserve the equality of states while strengthening the confederations. Powers, the small states, he argued, had not joined the Union to be overwhelmed by their larger neighbors. Delaware and Rhode Island possessed the same sovereignty as Virginia and Pennsylvania, and any just government must recognize this fundamental equality. The small states will never agree to a union in which they lose their equal voice. We are here as states, not as a mass of individuals, and states we must remain. William Paterson's argument would echo through the summer debates, a reminder that the Union was a compact between sovereign entities, not the creation of a single nation. The debates grew heated as the summer sun climbed higher. In the oppressive timidity of a Philadelphia July, tempers flared and fundamental differences threatened to shatter the convention before its work could be completed. Roger Sherman of Connecticut, his weather-beaten face bearing witness to decades of public service, watched the proceedings with the patience of one who understood that great works required time to mature. The question of representation struck at the heart of the American experiment. Should Congress represent the people directly, with seats apportioned by population? Or should it represent the states, with each enjoying equal voice regardless of size? The large states insisted that democracy demanded proportion. The small states argued that confederation required equality. The deadlock seemed absolute, the positions irreconcilable. Yet from this very deadlock would emerge the genius of American constitutionalism, the willingness to split the difference, to find in compromise not weakness, but strength. Sherman's Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise, offered a solution as elegant as it was practical. The House of Representatives would reflect population, giving voice to the people. The Senate would represent the states, equally preserving their sovereignty. Each chamber would check the other, ensuring that neither pure democracy nor Confederate equality could dominate. The summer wore on, and with each passing week the delegates found themselves crafting not merely a government, but a new form of political architecture. The separation of powers that Montesquieu had theorized, they would make practical. The checks and balances that existed in books, they would embed in actual institutions. An executive who could act with energy but not rule as a monarch. A legislature that could represent the people but not oppress the minority. A judiciary that could interpret the law but not make it. Alexander Hamilton, his brilliant mind racing ahead of his colleagues' caution, envisioned a strong national government that could command respect abroad and maintain order at home. His plan, presented in a 6-hour speech that left his audience stunned by its boldness, would have created an executive serving for life and state governors appointed by the federal government. It was too radical even for this gathering of revolutionaries, but it pushed the boundaries of possibility and made other proposals seem moderate by comparison. Benjamin Franklin, at 81, the oldest delegate, served as the convention's conscience and its memory when debates grew too heated, when positions seemed too rigid. His gentle humor and vast experience reminded the assembly of their common purpose. He had seen the colonies transform into states, had witnessed the birth of American diplomacy in the courts of Europe, and now watched as the final piece of the revolutionary puzzle fell into place. The question of slavery hung over the proceedings, like a storm cloud, never directly addressed but always present. The Southern delegates made clear that their states would never join a union that threatened their peculiar institution, while many Northern delegates found the idea of counting enslaved persons for representation purposes morally repugnant. The 3/5 compromise, as it would be known to history, satisfied no one's conscience but allowed the convention to continue its work. Gouverneur Morris, tasked with writing the final draft, wielded his pen like an artist's brush, transforming the rough prose of committee work into elegant constitutional language. "We, the people," he wrote, creating with those 3 words a foundation for national identity that would resonate across centuries. Not we the states, or we the undersigned, but we the people, announcing to the world that this government derived its just powers from the consent of the governed. As August yielded to September, the delegates found themselves possessed of a document that none had imagined when they first convened. They had entered the convention authorized to revise the Articles of Confederation and emerged with a completely new charter of government. Some, like George Mason of Virginia, refused to sign, disturbed by the absence of a Bill of Rights. Others, like Alexander Hamilton, signed despite reservations about the document's weaknesses. On September 17, 1787, 39 delegates affixed their signatures to the Constitution, creating not merely a government but a covenant between the American people and their posterity. Washington, sitting in the president's chair throughout the proceedings, had said little but observed everything. As he signed his name with deliberate strokes, he carried with him the hopes of a nation and the weight of uncertainty about whether this grand experiment would survive its birth. The document that emerged from Independence Hall carried within it both promise and peril, and the debates that would determine its fate began before the ink had dried on the signatures. The Constitution represented a radical departure from the Articles of Confederation, creating a national government with powers that many found frightening in their scope. The ratification process would test not only the document's merits, but the very idea of popular sovereignty upon which it rested. The Federalists, as supporters of the Constitution came to be known, understood that their task was not merely to explain their creation, but to sell it to a skeptical population. Alexander Hamilton, despite his reservations about the document's limitations, threw himself into the campaign for ratification with characteristic energy. Joined by James Madison and John Jay, he would craft a series of essays that remain to this day the finest exposition of American constitutional theory. The Federalist Papers, published in New York newspapers under the pseudonym Publius, addressed every conceivable objection to the proposed Constitution. Madison's Federalist 10, perhaps the most brilliant of the series, tackled head-on the question of faction and majority tyranny. In a large republic, he argued, the very diversity of interests would prevent any single faction from dominating the government. The cure for the diseases of democracy was more democracy, properly structured and wisely limited. Hamilton's contributions emphasized the necessity of energy in government, the importance of a strong executive, and the need for federal supremacy. In matters of national concern, his vision of American commerce and industry reaching across oceans required a government capable of speaking with one voice in foreign affairs and regulating trade with a firm hand. The weak Confederation had made America a laughingstock among nations. The new Constitution would restore respect for American power. But the Anti-Federalists, as the Constitution's opponents were labeled, possessed arguments no less compelling and fears no less rational. Patrick Henry, the voice of Virginia's Revolution, thundered against a document that would swallow state sovereignty and create a government as distant from the people as Parliament had been. Where are your checks in this government? He demanded, seeing in the proposed system not protection but potential oppression. George Clinton of New York, writing as Cato, argued that a republic could not survive across such vast distances, that representatives drawn from constituencies thousands of miles apart could never truly understand or represent their constituents' interests. The ancient republics had been small, intimate affairs where citizens knew their leaders personally. How could such intimacy exist in a nation spanning from Georgia to New Hampshire? Robert Yates, also of New York, writing as Brutus, raised perhaps the most prescient objection to the Constitution: the federal judiciary's power to interpret the supreme law of the land. Without explicit limits on judicial authority, he warned, unelected judges might become the final arbiters of American government, their lifetime tenure making them accountable to no one. The Constitution's language was broad enough to support almost any interpretation. An interpretation would become law. The judicial power of the United States is to be vested in a Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as Congress may, from time to time, ordain and establish. The judges both of the Supreme and inferior courts are to hold their offices during good behavior, which is, in other words, to hold them during life. Brutus foresaw the rise of judicial supremacy that would reshape American government in ways the framers never intended. The absence of a Bill of Rights became the Anti-Federalists' most powerful weapon. How could a document that claimed to secure liberty fail to protect the fundamental rights for which the Revolution had been fought? Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. These were not gifts from government, but natural rights that no government should possess the power to abridge. Without explicit protection, what would prevent Congress from establishing a national church or licensing newspapers? The state ratifying conventions became laboratories of democratic debate, with delegates chosen specifically to consider this single question. In Pennsylvania, the Federalists used their control of the legislature to force a quick ratifying convention, hoping to present the other states with a fait accompli. The strategy succeeded, but left bitter feelings among those who felt democracy had been subverted in democracy's name. Delaware, small and vulnerable, quickly ratified, seeing in the new government protection that the Confederation could not provide. Pennsylvania followed, but only after heated debates that revealed the depth of division within the state. New Jersey, like Delaware, saw advantage in a system that would protect small states from their larger neighbors. Georgia, threatened by Native American raids and Spanish intrigue, needed federal protection more than it feared federal power. Connecticut, the state that had provided the Great Compromise, ratified after securing informal assurances that a Bill of Rights would be added to the Constitution. Massachusetts proved more difficult, with strong anti-federalist sentiment threatening to defeat ratification. Only the promise of amendments, coupled with John Hancock's support, secured a narrow victory for the Federalists. In Virginia, the battle for ratification became a contest between titans. Madison, returning to his home state, found himself opposed by Patrick Henry, George Mason, and other giants of the Revolution. The debates in the Virginia Convention represented the highest level of constitutional discourse in American history, with both sides deploying arguments of remarkable sophistication and power. Henry's speeches against ratification combined passionate oratory with detailed constitutional analysis. He painted vivid pictures of federal tax collectors descending upon Virginia farms, of federal armies marching through Virginia towns, of Virginia's voice lost in a vast continental government where New England merchants and Pennsylvania manufacturers would outvote Southern planters. The Constitution, he argued, was not a compact between states, but a consolidation that would destroy state sovereignty forever. Madison, defending his creation, argued that the alternative to the Constitution was not the preservation of liberty, but its certain destruction. The Confederation was dissolving before their eyes, and without a stronger union, the states would either fragment into warring confederacies or fall victim to foreign powers seeking to exploit American weakness. Liberty required union, and union required government capable of governing. The young James Monroe, future president but then an anti-federalist delegate, worried that the Constitution gave Congress unlimited power to tax, that direct taxation would reduce the states to mere administrative units of the federal government. John Marshall, future Chief Justice, responded that direct taxation was a last resort, that the federal government would rely primarily on duties and excises, leaving direct taxation to the states, except in extraordinary circumstances. Edmund Randolph, who had refused to sign the Constitution in Philadelphia, now supported its ratification, convinced that the alternatives were worse than the risks. George Wythe, the respected law professor who had taught Jefferson and Marshall, used his influence to support ratification. The convention was closely divided, and every vote mattered. New York's ratification convention at Poughkeepsie became the final crucial battleground. Governor Clinton commanded a large anti-federalist majority, and his opposition to the Constitution was well known. Hamilton, despite being outnumbered 2-1, fought with the desperation of one who knew that New York's rejection would probably doom the new government before it could begin. The Federalist Papers had been written primarily for New York's audience, and Hamilton drew upon their arguments in the convention debates. He was joined by John Jay, who, despite injuries suffered in an anti-British riot, made crucial contributions to the Federalist cause. Jay's reputation for integrity and his experience in foreign affairs helped convince delegates that the Confederation's weakness in international relations posed real dangers to American interests. The news of Virginia's ratification, arriving in the midst of New York's debates, shifted the momentum toward the Federalists. 8 states had now ratified, and the new government would be formed with or without New York. But could it survive without the Empire State? Could the Union function with New York as a foreign country sitting between New England and the Southern states? Melancton Smith, the most effective anti-federalist debater at Poughkeepsie, gradually came to see that New York's interests lay with union rather than isolation. His conversion, when it came, proved decisive. On July 26, 1788, New York ratified the Constitution by the narrow margin of 3 votes, but with a list of proposed amendments longer than the document itself. North Carolina and Rhode Island remained outside the Union, preferring to observe the new government's behavior before committing themselves. Their absence was noted, but not mourning. 10 states were enough to begin the experiment in continental republicanism. The Constitution was law, but its success would depend not on the elegance of its language, but on the wisdom of those chosen to implement its provisions. As 1788 drew to a close, the American people prepared to choose their first president under the new Constitution. There was no doubt who that would be. George Washington's selection was so certain that the real question was whether he would accept the general who had surrendered his commission at Annapolis, who had refused suggestions that he become king, now faced the final call to service. From Mount Vernon, Washington watched the ratification process with the mixture of hope and apprehension that would characterize his approach to the presidency. He had helped create this new government. Now he must help it take its first steps. The world was watching, waiting to see whether the American experiment in self-government would prove that republics could endure, or whether this latest attempt would join the long list of failed democracies in history's dustbin. The Constitution was more than parchment and ink. It was a covenant between the American people and their future, a promise that government could be both powerful enough to govern and limited enough to remain free. Whether that promise could be kept would depend on the character of those who wielded the powers it created and the vigilance of those who lived under its authority. As winter settled over the new nation, as fires burned in hearths from Maine to Georgia, as families gathered to discuss the great questions of the day, the future remained unwritten. The Constitution provided a framework, but the content would be filled in by generations yet to come. The revolution was complete, but the work of building a more perfect union had only just begun, the weight of precedent settling upon his shoulders like snow upon ancient stone. Every decision would echo through generations yet unborn. Every choice would carve pathways for those who would follow in the uncertain dance of democracy. In the spring of 1789, as cherry blossoms graced the Hudson Valley and farmers turned their first furrows of the season, George Washington prepared to assume a role no American had ever held. The presidency stretched before him like an uncharted wilderness, without map or guide save the Constitution's spare words and the weight of expectation that hung heavy in the air of the young republic. The journey from Mount Vernon to New York carried him through landscapes that bore the scars and blessings of revolution. Fields once trampled by armies now showed green with spring crops. Towns that had known the thunder of cannons now hummed with the quieter music of commerce and craft. Children who had been born into war now played in streets where peace was learning to take root. On April 30th, 1789, on the balcony of Federal Hall, Washington placed his hand upon a Bible and spoke words that would resonate through centuries. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. The crowd below watched in reverent silence as history turned upon its axis, as the theoretical became reality, as the dream of self-governance took its first tentative breath. The early days of Washington's presidency unfolded with the careful deliberation of a master craftsman learning a new trade. Each decision required invention, Each choice demanded the creation of precedent where none existed. How should a president dress? How should he greet foreign dignitaries? What distance should separate the office from the people, and what intimacy should bind them together? These questions, seemingly small, carried the weight of defining democracy itself. Alexander Hamilton, now Secretary of the Treasury, brought to Washington's cabinet a vision of America's financial future that gleamed with possibility. His reports on public credit and manufacturing painted pictures of a nation that could stand among the economic powers of the world, its commerce flowing like rivers to the sea, its currency stable as bedrock, its industries humming with productive energy. Hamilton saw America not as a pastoral republic, but as a commercial empire. Its strength measured not only in moral authority, but in financial power. Yet Thomas Jefferson, serving as Secretary of State, carried within his heart a different dream of America's destiny. He envisioned a nation of farmers and philosophers, where virtue flourished in the soil of self-sufficiency, where the corruption of cities and commerce could not take root in the clean earth of agricultural democracy. Jefferson's America would be vast and green, its citizens connected to the land that fed them, its government minimal and distant as morning mist. The tension between these visions would shape the first years of the Republic, like competing winds, shaping the growth of a young tree. Hamilton's financial program, assumption of state debts, the creation of a national bank, the encouragement of manufacturing drew support from merchants and creditors who saw in it the promise of prosperity and stability. Jefferson's opposition rallied farmers and debtors who feared that Hamilton's system would create a new aristocracy of wealth, as dangerous to liberty as any titled nobility. Washington found himself standing between these titans, seeking always the middle path that would preserve both union and liberty. He understood that the nation needed financial stability to survive, yet he also grasped the deeper truth that democracy could not flourish if wealth became too concentrated, if the common citizen lost voice in the chorus of power. His task was to build a government strong enough to endure, yet flexible enough to bend with the winds of change. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 tested these principles like fire tests gold. In the mountains of western Pennsylvania, farmers who distilled their grain into whiskey rather than transport heavy crops across mountain passes saw Hamilton's excise tax as tyranny renewed. They had fought a revolution against taxation without representation. Now their own government seemed to impose burdens without understanding. When violence flared and federal authority was challenged, Washington faced a choice that would define the nature of American law with deliberate resolve. Washington called forth the militianet to crush dissent, but to affirm that in a democracy, grievances must be addressed through law rather than violence. He marched at the head of this force, the first and only sitting president to personally command troops in the field, demonstrating that the Constitution was not merely parchment but living law, backed by the will of the people and the strength of their government. As Washington's presidency progressed, the philosophical differences between Hamilton and Jefferson crystallized into something the founders had not anticipated and had hoped to avoid: political parties. These factions emerged not from personal ambition, but from fundamentally different visions of what America should become. They represented competing interpretations of the Revolution's meaning, alternative readings of the Constitution's intent, divergent paths toward the fulfillment of democratic promise. Hamilton's Federalists gathered around the belief that energy in government was essential to liberty's preservation. They looked to Britain's commercial success and saw models worth adapting, mechanisms of credit and industry that could lift America to greatness. They trusted in the wisdom of educated elites, believing that democratic government worked best when guided by those with the knowledge and stake in society necessary for sound judgment. Jefferson's Republicans, later to become Democrats, embraced a faith in the common citizen that ran as deep as American rivers. They believed that virtue and wisdom flowed not from education and wealth, but from honest labor and connection to the land. They looked to France's revolutionary fervor with sympathy, seeing in it the same spirit that had driven America's own struggle for independence. They feared that Hamilton's system would recreate in America the very corruptions they had fought to escape. Washington watched this division with growing sorrow, understanding that while political differences were inevitable in a free society, the hardening of those differences into permanent factions threatened the unity he had fought so hard to achieve. In his farewell address, he would warn against the baneful effects of the spirit of party, not because he opposed political debate, but because he feared that partisan loyalty might supersede loyalty to the nation itself. The election of 1796 tested the new nation's ability to transfer power peacefully between competing visions. John Adams, Washington's vice president, and a man whose dedication to independence had burned bright since the days of the Boston Massacre, won the presidency by the narrow margin of 3 electoral votes. Thomas Jefferson, finishing second, became vice president under the original constitutional system and arrangement that placed philosophical opponents in the same administration, like yoking horses that wished to run in different directions. Adams brought to the presidency a temperament as complex as the challenges he faced, brilliant and principled, passionate and stubborn. He possessed a lawyer's precision of mind and a farmer's distrust of luxury. He had negotiated peace with Britain when peace seemed impossible, had helped draft constitutions for his home state of Massachusetts, had served his country in the courts of Europe, where he learned that American independence was viewed with skepticism and American democracy with barely concealed contempt. The Adams presidency unfolded under clouds that gathered on both foreign and domestic horizons. France, in the throes of its own revolutionary convulsions, had begun seizing American merchant ships, viewing America's trade with Britain as betrayal of revolutionary solidarity. The Royal Navy, locked in death struggle with Napoleon's expanding empire, impressed American sailors into service, treating ships flying the Stars and Stripes as extensions of British territory. Caught between these titans, America discovered the price of weakness in a world where strength determined survival. The quasi-war with France tested the new nation's ability to defend its interests without abandoning its principles. Adams, showing the same courage that had once led him to defend British soldiers after the Boston Massacre, chose the difficult path of measured response over the easy road of popular passion. When war fever gripped the nation and many called for full conflict with France, Adams pursued diplomacy with the patience of a man who understood that young republics rarely survive the test of major wars. When the Alien and Sedition Acts, passed by a Federalist Congress fearful of foreign influence and domestic dissent, threatened to criminalize political opposition, Adams enforced them with reluctance, understanding that security measures could not be allowed to strangle the very freedoms they claimed to protect. Jefferson and Madison, watching these developments from their Virginia strongholds, saw in the Alien and Sedition Acts a threat to the Constitution itself. Their response, Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, asserted that states could judge the constitutionality of federal actions and refuse to enforce laws they deemed unconstitutional. This doctrine of nullification opened questions that would haunt the nation for generations. What happened when state and federal authority collided? Who would serve as final arbiter of constitutional meaning? The election of 1800 brought these tensions to a crisis that tested whether American democracy could survive its first peaceful transfer of power between opposing parties. Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied in the Electoral College, throwing the decision to the House of Representatives, where Federalists held the balance of power. For 36 ballots, the House remained deadlocked while the nation held its breath, wondering if the Constitution's mechanisms would prove adequate to resolve such an impasse. Alexander Hamilton, despite his philosophical differences with Jefferson, recognized that Jefferson's agrarian republicanism posed less threat to constitutional government than Burr's unprincipled ambition. In quiet conversations and careful letters, Hamilton used his influence to break the deadlock, ensuring Jefferson's election and demonstrating that American politicians could place national interest above partisan advantage when the stakes demanded it. Jefferson's inauguration on March 4, 1801, marked a moment of triumph for democratic ideals. His inaugural address spoke of healing the wounds of political division, of recognizing that we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists in our shared commitment to constitutional government. The man who had written that all men are created equal now stood where Washington had stood, demonstrating that in America, power would flow not from birth or wealth alone, but from the consent of the governed. Jefferson's presidency would be tested not only by domestic challenges, but by an opportunity so vast it strained the very boundaries of constitutional interpretation. Napoleon Bonaparte, master of Europe and dreamer of global empire, found his attention drawn from American territories by the demands of European warfare. Louisiana, that immense territory stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, became a bargaining chip in geopolitical calculations that dwarfed even Jefferson's expansive vision. The purchase of Louisiana for $15 million doubled the size of the United States with the stroke of a pen. Yet this magnificent opportunity created a constitutional crisis for Jefferson, who had long argued for strict interpretation of federal powers. Nowhere did the Constitution explicitly grant the federal government authority to acquire new territory. Yet the opportunity to secure America's western expansion and control of the Mississippi River was too precious to sacrifice on the altar of constitutional purity. Jefferson's decision to proceed with the purchase, despite his constitutional qualms, demonstrated the pragmatic wisdom that would characterize American governance at its best. He understood that constitutions must be living documents, capable of adaptation to circumstances their framers could not foresee. The Louisiana Purchase became precedent for the principle that constitutional interpretation must sometimes yield to national necessity, that the perfect could not be allowed to destroy the good. Lewis and Clark's expedition into this newly acquired territory embodied the spirit of American exploration and discovery that would define the nation's character as they traced the Missouri River toward its sources, as they crossed the Continental Divide and descended the Columbia River to the Pacific. They were mapping not merely geography, but possibility itself. Their journals recorded encounters with Native American peoples whose knowledge of the land proved essential to the expedition's success, whose existence reminded the expanding nation that this continent had been home to complex civilizations. Long before European arrival, the expedition's return in 1806 with tales of vast prairies, towering mountains, and a coastline kissed by Pacific waves fired American imaginations with visions of continental destiny. The young republic that had once clung to the Atlantic seaboard now contemplated a future that stretched from sea to shining sea. A future that seemed to validate Jefferson's faith in America's capacity for infinite growth and renewal. Yet even as America expanded westward, old tensions with Britain festered like unhealed wounds. British impressment of American sailors continued, treating American citizenship as a temporary convenience that dissolved whenever the Royal Navy needed men. British support for Native American resistance to American expansion threatened the security of frontier settlements. Trade restrictions designed to starve Napoleon's Europe also strangled American commerce, turning the Atlantic into a British lake where American ships sailed only at British sufferance. James Madison, inheriting the presidency from Jefferson in 1809, found himself confronting the same challenges that had tested Adams a decade earlier. A quiet scholar whose diminutive stature belied the power of his intellect. Madison had helped frame the Constitution and understood better than perhaps any man alive the delicate balance between federal authority and individual liberty. Yet, understanding constitutional theory proved different from wielding executive power in times of crisis. The Warhawks in Congress, led by Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, pressed for military action against Britain. With the fervor of young men who had never known defeat, they spoke of national honor and American dignity, of the need to prove that the American Revolution had created not merely independence, but lasting strength. Their voices carried the confidence of a generation that had inherited freedom and felt called to defend it with the same courage their fathers had shown. When war came in June 1812, it tested American resolve as the Revolution never had. This time, America fought alone, without European allies, against the world's dominant naval power. American armies suffered humiliating defeats in Canada. British forces burned Washington itself, sending Madison and his government fleeing into the Maryland countryside while flames consumed the Capitol and the President's house. Yet, American persistence slowly began to tell. Naval victories on Lake Erie and Lake Champlain proved that American ships could match British vessels when the odds were even. Andrew Jackson's crushing defeat of British forces at New Orleans, though it came after peace had been signed at Ghent, demonstrated that American arms could triumph against Europe's finest troops when led with skill and determination. The Treaty of Ghent, signed on Christmas Eve, 1814, resolved none of the issues that had caused the war, yet somehow achieved everything America had fought to prove. Impressment ended not through treaty provision, but through the ending of the Napoleonic Wars that had made it necessary. British support for Native American resistance faded as Britain's attention turned to European reconstruction. America had proven its staying power, its ability to endure invasion and emerge with its independence intact. The years following the War of 1812 brought a surge of national confidence that historians would later call the era of good feelings. James Monroe's presidency coincided with a period when partisan divisions seemed to fade before shared pride in American achievement. The Federalist Party, discredited by its opposition to a popular war, withered away, leaving the field to Jefferson's Republicans, who had guided the nation through its greatest trial since independence. This era witnessed the emergence of a distinctly American culture, no longer derivative of European models but confident in its own identity. American literature began to find its voice in the works of Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper. American art celebrated American landscapes and American achievements. American architecture adapted classical forms to democratic purposes, creating buildings that spoke of Republican virtue rather than royal grandeur. The Missouri, Compromise of 1820 revealed the deepest challenge to this emerging national identity. When Missouri sought admission to the Union as a slave state, the question of slavery's expansion forced Americans to confront contradictions they had hoped time would resolve. Henry Clay's compromise admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, while prohibiting slavery north of the 3,630 parallel preserved the Union's immediate peace, but could not heal the moral wound that slavery inflicted upon American ideals. Thomas Jefferson, observing this crisis from his retirement at Monticello, described the Missouri question as a fire bell in the night that awakened him with terror for the Union's future. He understood that the compromise had not resolved the slavery question, but merely postponed its reckoning. The man who had written that all men are created equal, while owning enslaved human beings, embodied the contradiction that would ultimately tear the nation apart. Monroe's presidency also witnessed the articulation of the Monroe Doctrine, a bold assertion of American authority over the Western Hemisphere that reflected the young nation's growing confidence. When European powers threatened to restore Spanish control over Latin American republics that had won their independence, Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, declared that any European attempt to extend their political systems to the Americas would be considered dangerous to American peace and safety. This doctrine, backed more by British naval power than American military strength, nevertheless marked America's emergence as a regional power with global ambitions. The nation that had once feared for its survival now claimed authority over an entire hemisphere, demonstrating how far American confidence had traveled in the half-century since independence. As the 1820s unfolded, the last generation of revolutionary leaders began to pass from the stage they had dominated for half a century. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams reconciled in their old age after years of political enmity, carried on a correspondence that revealed the depth of their shared commitment to American ideals despite their tactical disagreements. Their letters spoke of hope for America's future, of pride in what had been accomplished, of concern for challenges that lay ahead. On July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, both Jefferson and Adams died within hours of each other, as if the country they had helped create was calling its founders home on the very day it celebrated their greatest achievement. Adams's last words, "Thomas Jefferson survives," proved prophetically wrong in fact, yet symbolically true in spirit. For Jefferson's vision of democratic possibility would indeed survive to inspire future generations. The election of 1824 brought forward a new generation of leaders who had learned politics in the school of American experience rather than in opposition to British rule. John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and William Crawford represented different regions and different visions of America's future, but all were products of the system the founders had created, proof that American democracy could produce leaders capable of governing without kings or nobles to guide them. When no candidate received a majority in the Electoral College, the election went to the House of Representatives as the Constitution provided. Henry Clay's support secured the presidency for John Quincy Adams, leading Jackson's supporters to cry corrupt bargain. When Adams appointed Clay as Secretary of State, this controversy demonstrated both the strength and the weakness of American democracy's ability to resolve constitutional crises peacefully, but also its vulnerability to suspicions of elite manipulation. John Quincy Adams brought to the presidency an intellectual brilliance that rivaled his father's, along with a vision of federal government as an active agent of national improvement. His proposals for a national university, a naval academy, astronomical observatories, and internal improvements reflected a belief that democratic government should promote the general welfare through education, science, and economic development. Yet, Adams's presidency founded on the very democratic currents that his father's generation had unleashed. The American people had grown suspicious of elite leadership, preferring leaders who seemed to rise from their own ranks rather than from established families. Andrew Jackson's victory in 1828 represented not merely a change of administration, but a transformation of American political culture, a shift toward a more egalitarian democracy that trusted common sense more than formal education. Andrew Jackson's inauguration in March 1829 symbolized the completion of the Democratic Revolution. The founders had begun, but had not fully embraced. The crowds that thronged Washington for his inaugural celebration represented a different America than the one that had witnessed Washington's dignified ceremony 40 years earlier. These were farmers and mechanics, shopkeepers and laborers, people who saw in Jackson's rise their own vindication, their own claim to political authority. Jackson himself embodied this democratic transformation. Born in poverty on the Carolina frontier, orphaned by the Revolution, scarred by British sabers, and marked by dueling pistols, he rose through talent and determination rather than birth or education. His military victories against Creek Indians and British regulars had made him a national hero, but his appeal ran deeper than mere military fame. In Jackson, ordinary Americans saw themselves their struggles, their values, their potential for greatness. The Jacksonian era witnessed the expansion of democracy beyond anything the founders had imagined. State after state eliminated property requirements for voting, extending suffrage to all white males regardless of wealth or education. Political parties developed sophisticated organizations to mobilize these new voters, creating a system of democratic participation that reached into every village and neighborhood. Jackson's presidency tested constitutional limits in ways that alarmed traditional Republicans but thrilled Democratic advocates. His use of the presidential veto as a policy weapon rather than merely a constitutional check transformed the presidency from Washington's model of Republican restraint into a populist bully pulpit. His destruction of the Bank of the United States reflected both democratic hostility to concentrated economic power and presidential willingness to challenge institutions that seemed to serve elite rather than popular interests. The nullification crisis of 1832-33 brought the tension between federal authority and state rights to its sharpest focus since the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. When South Carolina declared federal tariffs null and void within its borders, Jackson responded with characteristic determination, threatening military force while working for compromise. His toast at a Jefferson Day dinner, "Our Union, it must be preserved," left no doubt where he stood when forced to choose between federal authority and state rights. As Jackson's presidency gave way to Martin Van Buren's The American Experiment in democratic government had survived every test its enemies had predicted would destroy it. The transfer of power between parties had become routine rather than revolutionary. The expansion of suffrage had strengthened rather than weakened the system. The rough edges of popular democracy had been smoothed by experience and institutions that channeled popular will into constructive governance. Yet challenges remained that tested the foundations of American democracy. The Industrial Revolution was creating new concentrations of wealth and poverty that strained traditional assumptions about democratic equality. The expansion westward brought Americans into contact with Mexican territories and Native American peoples whose rights and sovereignty complicated simple narratives of democratic progress. The Depression that began in 1837 demonstrated democracy's vulnerability to economic forces beyond political control. Van Buren's principled refusal to use federal power to address economic suffering reflected older Republican beliefs about limited government, but it also revealed the inadequacy of those beliefs when confronted with the complexities of modern economic life. William Henry Harrison's election in 1840, followed by his death after 31 days in office, brought John Tyler to the presidency and demonstrated the Constitution's ability to handle even unexpected succession crises. Tyler's break with his own Whig Party over economic policy showed that American democracy could accommodate principled dissent even at the highest levels of government. The 1840s witnessed the full flowering of American confidence in democratic institutions and democratic values. The phrase "manifest destiny" captured popular belief that American democratic ideals were destined to spread across the continent and perhaps beyond. This confidence reflected genuine achievements, the creation of stable institutions, the expansion of opportunity, the development of a culture that celebrated individual achievement while maintaining social cohesion. James K. Polk's presidency demonstrated both the power and the peril of this democratic confidence. His successful prosecution of the Mexican-American War secured California and the Southwest for the United States, fulfilling dreams of continental expansion that dated back to Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase. Yet this expansion also reopened the slavery question with an intensity that threatened to tear apart the democratic coalition that had governed the country since Jackson's time. By 1850, 74 years after the Declaration of Independence, and 61 years after the Constitution's ratification, the American experiment had proven its durability in ways few could have imagined in those uncertain early days. The nation had survived foreign wars and domestic rebellions, economic depressions and political crises, the deaths of founders, and the rise of new generations of leaders. The institutions created by the founders had adapted and evolved without losing their essential character. The presidency had grown in power and influence while remaining accountable to democratic control. Congress had become more representative and more responsive to popular will, while maintaining its deliberative character. The Supreme Court had assumed the role of constitutional interpreter while avoiding direct confrontation with democratic majorities. The federal system had proven flexible enough to accommodate both unity and diversity, allowing states to serve as laboratories of democracy while maintaining national coherence. The Bill of Rights had protected individual liberty while permitting majority rule. The party system had channeled political conflict into constructive competition rather than destructive violence. Yet the founders' vision remained incomplete, its promises unfulfilled for millions of Americans. Women remained excluded from political participation despite their contributions to the Revolution and the early Republic. Native Americans found their sovereignty progressively diminished, despite treaty guarantees and their own claims to the continent. African Americans, whether enslaved or free, lived under legal and social restrictions that mocked the Declaration's promise that all men are created equal. The slavery question, temporarily resolved by successive compromises, continued to fester, like an unhealed wound at the heart of American democracy. The economic and moral contradictions between freedom and bondage grew sharper as the nation expanded, as industrial development created new forms of labor, as democratic ideals spread to challenge all forms of human oppression. The founders had created a framework for democratic government, but they had also bequeathed to their descendants the responsibility of fulfilling democracy's promise. Each generation would have to decide anew what it meant to be American, what obligations citizenship entailed, what price freedom demanded. The Constitution provided the mechanism for peaceful change, but it could not guarantee that change would come easily or without conflict. As the 1850s dawned, the United States stood at another crossroads in its continuing journey toward a more perfect union. The choices ahead would test whether the democratic institutions created by the founders could survive their greatest challenge yet, the question of whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could endure half slave and half free. The founding generation had done their work, had created a nation and given it laws, had established precedents and traditions that would guide their successors through trials yet unknown. Now it fell to their children and grandchildren to preserve what had been won, to extend what had been begun, to fulfill the promises that had been made. In quiet moments, when the wind moved through the trees at Mount Vernon or rustled the leaves around Monticello, when it whispered across the Potomac where Washington had crossed, or stirred the grass at Valley Forge where soldiers had suffered, it seemed to carry the voices of those who had given their lives and fortunes and sacred honor to the cause of human freedom. Their words echoed through time, that government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed, that life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness are the birthright of all humanity, that a free people can govern themselves if they possess the wisdom and courage to do so. The American Revolution had ended, but the American experiment continued. Each sunrise brought new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to prove that democracy could work, that freedom could endure, that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when guided by noble principles and supported by just institutions. The founders had planted seeds in the soil of history. Some had grown into mighty trees that sheltered generations of Americans. Others remained dormant, waiting for the right season, the right circumstances, the right leaders to bring them to fruition. The harvest was not yet complete, might never be complete, for democracy is not a destination but a journey, not an achievement but an aspiration, not a victory but a continuing struggle in the end. The story of America's founding was not just the story of great men and great events, though it contained both in abundance. It was the story of an idea of the revolutionary notion that people could govern themselves, that freedom was not the privilege of the few but the right of all, that the future could be different from the past if ordinary citizens possessed the courage to make it so. That idea had taken root in American soil, had grown and flourished despite drought and storm, had spread its branches wide enough to shelter a continent. Its fruits had fed the hungry, its shade had comforted the weary, its example had inspired the oppressed around the world. Yet the tree was still growing, still reaching toward the light, still putting down deeper roots, still extending its protective embrace to those who sought refuge in its shadow. The founders had done what they could. They had written the words, signed the documents, fought the battles, made the compromises that created a nation. Now their work lived on in the hands of those who came after, in the hearts of those who still believed that government of the people, by the people and for the people could endure upon the earth. Somewhere in the American night, in cities and towns and farmhouses scattered across a continent, their descendants slept safely beneath the flag they had given their lives to create, protected by laws they had written, guided by principles they had proclaimed. In the morning, Those descendants would wake to face new challenges with the tools the founders had provided: the Constitution's framework, democracy's processes, freedom's promise. The revolution was over, but the republic endured. The founders were gone, but their legacy lived on. The experiment continued, as it always would, as long as free people possessed the wisdom to cherish what had been won and the courage to perfect what had been begun. In that continuing struggle lay the true meaning of the American founding, not as an ending but as a beginning, not as completion but as commitment, not as arrival but as departure toward horizons yet unexplored. The stars that had witnessed the signing of the Declaration still wheeled overhead, constant in their courses yet ever moving, like the principles the founders had proclaimed, eternal in their truth, yet dynamic in their application, fixed in their essence, yet flowing like rivers toward seas of possibility yet to be discovered. Under those same stars, the work of democracy continued, the experiment persisted, the dream endured, and in that endurance lay the founders' greatest victory, not that they had created a perfect nation, for perfection was never their goal, but that they had created a perfectible one, a country capable of growth and change and renewal, a republic that could correct its errors and extend its blessings and fulfill its promises to all who dwelt within its borders or aspired to join its ranks. That was their gift to posterity, not a finished monument but a living legacy, not a closed book but an open story, not an end but an eternal beginning. The quill pens have long since crumbled to dust, and the hands that held them lie quiet beneath weathered stone. The voices that once rang in Philadelphia's halls now speak only through the documents they left behind, their words preserved like amber holding ancient light. Yet in courtrooms and classrooms, in town halls and voting booths, their presence lingers, still not as ghosts haunting the past, but as guides illuminating the path ahead. What they built may have been imperfect, but it was improvable. What they began may have been incomplete, but it was continuable. What they dreamed may have been deferred, but it was not destroyed. In every citizen who votes, every voice raised, in peaceful protest, every hand extended in welcome to the stranger, their revolution continues, not as memory but as promise, not as history but as hope, not as then but as now, always now, in the eternal present of democracy's unfinished song.